Thank you so much for jumping in and thank you for watching today. Regardless of when you're watching this, it is my hope and it is my prayer that the things that I share tonight will impact you, but not just impact you, but that it will impact the community around you and future generations to come. On this past Sunday, I started a series titled I'm Changing My Story. And I do not think that this series will have the impact that God intends for it to have unless I am willing to be transparent and vulnerable and uncomfortable with sharing my story with each of you. After prayer and after waiting to hear from God, I finally got the release that it is time for me to share my story. I have reached out to my family members, my brother, my mother, and my son, Benjamin. And I have gotten permission from both of them to share my story. I did this because many times when people share tell-alls, it involves other people and it can impact other people's lives. And so I wanted permission from both of those individuals prior to me divulging a tell-all to share my story. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, on Tuesdays, I'm going to share my story with you. And I am very uncomfortable in doing this. While I have taught for 19 years from an expository standpoint of using scriptures and using subjects and points, there has been a written script for me to share things. And I've always found comfort with inside of the guidelines of those written scripts. And so in sharing my story, it means that I have to allow you in a place that I have never been comfortable with allowing people too close. I've always considered that the more you know, the more you could use against me. And some of the things that I've endured in my life has been so hurtful and so dark and so damaging that I have even blocked out moments that I have a hard time remembering and recalling. Revelations chapter 12, verse number 11 says, and they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their own lives unto death. And so tonight it is through the art of me being vulnerable and being transparent that I'm going to share my story with you. Again, this is just going to be part one. I'm going to go through most of my story that the Lord gives me a release to share. And I hope that it is in the sharing of this story that, one, you can find yourself and you can hear bits and pieces of your own life. Now, I don't want to just share a story. Some people will just do a tell-all and just share their story. But it is my intent that in sharing my story, that I will be able to connect the moments that I endured with where I am now and be able to connect them to how I see that they have helped me to grow and to develop so that you can see hope for yourself and for your life. I've taken a few notes because, again, this is difficult for me. And so I want to take a few notes from my life so that I can share with you in detail and also make those connections. Again, I did get permission from my family in order to do this. Where do I start? I am going to start from the day my entire life changed. But I want to give you a little context leading up to the day that my entire life changed so that you can understand the depth and the weight of the trauma that changed me. So when I was growing up back in the 80s, yes, I'm that old, I lived a very sheltered life. I lived with my mother, my father, and my brother. For many years, it was just my father, and my mother. And to the outside, we had a picture perfect life. My father was pretty well known in the music industry. And so it was nothing on a Saturday morning for me to wake up and come downstairs and there was, music personalities or preachers or well-known people just sitting at our kitchen table. Our house was always filled with laughter and with singing and with games and so much fun. My mother and my father, they ended up building this big, beautiful, huge home. For those that are in Virginia, in Chesterfield, Virginia, it was a big white house with 5 windows at the top, 4 windows at the bottom, and a red door in the center that sat on top of a hill. We had just or had a new car, and we were living what I thought and what I knew to be the dream. We always had food and plenty of it, always had people and plenty of them, always had laughter and plenty of them. But there was one day throughout the course of, there was one day where everything just began to shift and it shattered. I remember this one day that I think it was a Thursday or Wednesday or Thursday night where our washer had just gone out or a dryer had just gone out for some reason. And my mother had just washed clothes, and my dad had just washed clothes, and it was getting pretty late at night. I was downstairs playing on the Nintendo, on the big wooden box television that we used to have. And I was playing Nintendo, and my dad got a phone call. And not too long after that phone call, he jumped up and he said, "I'm going to dry the clothes." And I'm not sure what rose up in me, but something rose up in me. And I just immediately began to, beg him, "Let me go with you, Dad. I want to go with you." And I remember doing all types of things, saying all types of things, trying to convince him and plead my case that I should be able to go. And it was kind of unusual that he would not allow me to go with him because up to that point, man, my dad had spoiled me. I don't really recall hearing my dad say no. And if he did say no, then he always would do whatever it was that I asked him to do. So this was a little unusual to me. But I just remember doing everything and saying everything I could possibly say to get him to let me go with him. And he didn't let me go. That night, I had a very bad, disturbing dream. I don't remember the details of it. I just remember the feeling after that dream. And when I woke up that morning, my mother wasn't there, and neither was my father. But my aunt had driven from over an hour, almost 2 hours away, and she was there, which was not normal. So she came up to me and she gave me a little nickname. She used to call me Michael James after a famous designer. She came up to me and she said, "Hey, Michael James, how are you?" And very lighthearted. I didn't think anything else of it besides it was just kind of weird that she was there and my parents weren't. And she talked to me for a little while, and then I kind of walked off. I walked over to the dining room window, and I was looking out of the window, and I just heard God say, "Your dad has been shot." And I, I had never really heard, or I'd heard God's voice before, but to tell me something that had happened, I had never heard his voice tell me something that had happened. I had only heard God when I was 6 years old tell me what I was going to do in life, which I'm doing now. Um, but I'd never heard him tell me about something that had happened. And so this was a little shocking. And I was, what, 7 or 8 years old. So I wasn't really sure what I was hearing or why I was hearing it. But when my aunt came back in the room, I asked her, and she said, "How did you know?" And I didn't know. I just knew God had told me. But it was that day that everything I had known up to that point shattered. The perfect life that I knew, the rose-colored lens that I saw everyone through, the way that I saw the world, the way that I saw my parents, the way that I saw my family, the way that I saw people, the way that I saw my friends, the way that I saw God, everything shifted in that one day. How did it shift? Well, upon finding out that my father had been shot, um, my family immediately for a couple of days went into this witness protection program because my father said he didn't know who had shot him, and the story was on the news. You can still probably look the story up now. And he had to assume for a while a fictitious name. I still remember the name. It was Miguel Cortez. I don't know why I recall that name from all of those years ago. Um, but we would go up to the hospital to go see him. And I remember one of the days where we went up to the hospital to go see him, um, my mother's disposition changed. Come to find out later, of course, she had spoken with the doctor, and the doctor had shared some news with her that shattered her entire life as well. I'll tell you a little bit about that a little later on. But over the course of that next 2 to 3 weeks, um, we moved abruptly out of our home. My father got out of the hospital. We came into the house, and I just remember walking up the steps, seeing my father laying in the bed because he really couldn't get up because he was shot in his head. And as he was laying in the bed, I remember my mom saying, "Go get all of your stuff, we're leaving." I didn't know, of course, what was happening or why it was happening. I just remember that for some reason I had already had a few things already packed. I didn't know why I had things packed in this little metal lunchbox that I had. It was weird stuff that I had packed in there. But we moved all of our stuff in trash bags or in whatever we could find at that moment. And we moved out of that picture perfect life. And we ended up moving with my grandmother in a 100-year-old house. And my grandmother, of course, was born in 1915, so she lived through the Great Depression. And so I'm pretty sure you know what type of woman she was. While she was loving in her own way, it was a complete difference from what I was used to. We had no central air. We had no central heat. We didn't have any real clean conditions. Where I did have a shower, we had to start to take baths in the sink. My grandmother was very conscious over how much water was used because we had well water. And then after that, for the next few months, I started finding out a little bit more and more of the details to what led up to that transition of our whole entire life shattering. Um, I remember the day I was standing inside of a grocery store not too long after this had happened, and I remember the aisle that I was on inside of the grocery store, where my mother shared with me that my father had contracted HIV, or full blown AIDS, as well as being shot in the head. And so from that point, my life began to even go down further, down this path, because now not only did I have to deal with our life changing abruptly from not being in the same home with my father, from not having the life that I had previously had, but now I had to deal with the thought of my father's death. Now, I want to back up to share this part. There were moments after we moved and after the entire situation began to unfold that I carried this tremendous amount of guilt. You see, I had begged my father the night that he left the house to let me go with him. And I had done everything I could in my power to convince him to let me go. And he told me no. And the events that happened after that, I internalized them as being my fault. Because I felt like if I had said something better or if I had done something better, then he would not have left. And if he wouldn't have left, then he wouldn't have gotten shot. If wouldn't have gotten shot, then we wouldn't have had to have left the house. And everything else that transpired would not have happened if I had just done better. And that translated into my adulthood and into my relationships. Not just my relationships with my intimate relationships, but those relationships on my job, the relationships in my family, the relationships with significant others, my friends. There was always this part of me that figured that if I could do something to show them enough of who I was, then it might be able to change the results. It turned into me trying to people please. It turned into me, from that point forward, living this life of always trying to jump through these hoops to please people so that they will make the right decisions concerning me. So, as life began to unfold, my mother, of course, had a nervous breakdown over a series of maybe about a year. And she became extremely paranoid, so paranoid that we could be standing in the bedroom and she could see the ceiling fan or could see something in the corner that she would immediately think it was a demon, because not only did my life crash, but her life crashed as well. Everything that she knew, she found out was fake. The life that she thought she had, she found out that none of it was real. At the same time that she was finding that out, it began to have a psychological and emotional impact. So she began to not trust situations or circumstances. Now, as a child that was with her, that was watching her and trying to help her and trying to, um, she will say, she leaned on me heavily throughout that time. I began to assimilate and mirror what I saw her be. So the paranoia or the being hyper vigilant, being an overthinker, it began to evolve from the place of watching my mom process the trauma at her adult age. And so my young, inexperienced age, I began to assimilate, and it carried over into my adulthood to where now, in circumstances and in situations with other people, I carry this hyper-vigilant weight of judging and watching every action, putting up walls in order to protect myself because that's what I saw done. I once heard someone share a story of how things passed down generationally to people. How this woman went to go cook a ham and she cut the end off of the ham. And her husband said, you know, why do you cut the end off of the ham all the time? And she said, I don't know. I just saw my mom do it. And she said, let me call my mom and ask her, does it add more flavor to it or something? And so she called her mom, and her mom started laughing and said, no, baby, I cut the end off of the ham because my stove wasn't large enough to actually fit the entire ham. And so the woman had been doing what she saw when she no longer needed to do it. And so I allowed the trauma of what I watched my mother and how I watched my mother process through one of the most traumatic moments of her life. I carried that over into my life to begin to do the same exact thing. It's amazing how the early years of our life, what we see and how we see people operate and process, how we carry them over into the present moments of our life where we have situations that God has brought freedom to us. God has brought the people that we desire to us. God has brought to us the things that we desire, and we can sabotage those things because of traumatic responses that we continue to operate in. And I share this story with you guys tonight in the hopes that you will be able to connect. Some of those ways of thinking, those ways of perceiving people, some of those walls that you put up, that you would be able to recognize them, identify them, so that you can live life outside of the generational trauma that has been passed down to you. Now, I know that in sharing my story over the next couple of weeks, that there may be many people that may distance themselves from me. I understand that there will be people that will be angry and that will be upset. But I am willing to leave the 99 to find the one. I am willing to allow those that have a right to operate and live in truth and choose not to because it feels better to live under the auspices of a lie for the sake of protection. But I must share my story because this is indeed my story. And when we look at people, when people look at me, they only see my exterior. They only hear the confidence of how I talk and how I speak. They only hear the wisdom that falls from my lips. They only hear the after result. But I don't think that I do us any justice by not sharing with you that there was a story behind everything that you see. Over the course of a few years or a few months, we lost the home. Both sides of my family became enemies of each other. The family that I had known and grew up to love ever so much. Now, my mother's side began to become enemies with my father's side. Because of protection of my mom, they felt like you put everybody at risk. Now, I must speak up for my father to say a lot of the reason why he put everyone at risk is out of his own fear. He was afraid to be honest because he was afraid of how it would damage the reputation of his family. Yeah, see, I grew up in a family that we don't talk about anything. You mention something and people will tell you, hush, boy, don't say that out your mouth. Everything is a secret. Everything is always hidden. Nothing is ever talked about. And so because of him not being able to be open, to be honest, and to be transparent, he had to cover things up in a lie. And many might say, why are you telling your father's business? And to that, I say, I am honoring my father. And I am using the voice that he was afraid to use so that his story will not be in vain. That what he endured will not be in vain. Because there is someone else right now that has had to live lies, that has had to hide things. And while you think and believe that you may be protecting yourself, you're hurting someone else. I am sharing my father's story and my mother's story because if we keep it in darkness, whatever stays in the darkness, it will eventually begin to erode and to kill. You leave water in darkness long enough, bacteria will begin to grow. And it can become lethal and deadly to someone. And so I honor my father and my mother by sharing what we've been through. Again, over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to share more. This was a lot for me today. It took me many different takes to try to record this. And then finally, I just said, I'm just going to turn the camera on. And how it comes out, it comes out. I'm going to ask you over the next couple of weeks to continue to pray for me. Continue to lift me up. And show me a little grace. I may not get it right. I may mess up in some parts of not connecting the dots and the pieces correctly. But I want to share in hopes that someone else will be free. Thank you for watching today. Please come back next Tuesday as I begin to dive in a little bit deeper and to share even more, because there's so much more of the things that I went through, and make the connections for how I came through so that you can come through as well. Maybe you need prayer. Just simply say, I need prayer. Our prayer team prays every single Thursday at 7 o'clock p.m., at 6 o'clock a.m. Please consider subscribing so that you won't miss these series as I begin to share my story with you guys. If you are a partner, there is a link that will be in the bio so that you can use that link to continue to sow and to give as you guys do every single week. Other than thank you so much for listening, and I will see you again next Tuesday. God bless you. Have a wonderful day.